They told you history was written in stone, but stone can lie. Some stories were never carved for public eyes, only whispered in back rooms, traded in letters that never survived the flames. Tonight, I'll show you one of those stories. A pact made in the dead of night that condemned 2 children to lives that were not their own and shattered one of America's wealthiest dynasties from the inside out. Imagine Charleston, South Carolina, 1832. A storm rages over the harbor, lightning clawing at the sky like some unholy omen. Inside a mansion wrapped in shadows, 2 women scream through the agony of childbirth. One, a French countess draped in silks, fighting to maintain her dignity even as pain tears through her body. The other, her personal slave, delivering her child in a small, dimly lit cottage just yards away. By dawn, both babies would be gone, replaced, exchanged, rewritten into fates more twisted than anything their mothers could have imagined. You weren't supposed to know about this. The courts burned the records in 1923, families rewrote their genealogies to cover the stain, and yet fragments survived, a letter here, a rumor there, stories whispered by servants on their deathbeds. It's enough to trace the outline of a conspiracy so dangerous that even speaking of it in its time could have cost you your life. Ask yourself this: if an entire bloodline could be rewritten by one midnight deception, how many other families, how many other dynasties were built on the same lies? If one baby can be stolen into wealth and another condemned to chains, what does heritage even mean? And who among today's elites carries blood that was never theirs to claim? The story you're about to hear is not just about 2 mothers, it's about power, about the machinery of deception, about how institutions, marriage, slavery, medicine, law were used not just to control the living, but to erase and reforge reality itself. The Countess Margot de Villefort and her slave Celeste, 2 women who should have been enemies, bound together by betrayal, desire, and survival. Their pact would shape the lives of politicians, judges, and men who thought they were masters of the South, but who were secretly puppets of a decision made in a storm-soaked night. And here's the truth: this was no isolated scandal. The Puritan family's collapse was just the crack that revealed the foundation. Beneath Charleston's marble parlors and magnolia gardens was a hidden economy of switched babies, forged wills, and carefully curated lies. It wasn't just survival, it was systematized fraud, an unspoken insurance policy of the Southern elite. But before we descend fully into the heart of this darkness, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your state in the comments below, because this story reaches farther than Charleston. It spreads into bloodlines across America, and one of them might be yours. Understand this: by staying here, by hearing what I'm about to tell you, you're stepping into a shadow history. Once you know it, you can't unknow it. You'll start to see patterns where others see coincidence. You'll question names, dates, lineages. You'll wonder if the story of your own family is exactly what you were told, or whether, like the Puritans, it was rewritten long ago in the silence of a storm. This is the story of the deadly Pact of 1832, and it begins with 2 women who gave birth on the same night and the exchange that would damn them both. The Puritan mansion stood like a fortress of old wealth, its Georgian facade gazing out over Charleston harbor as if it commanded the tides themselves. On that storm-lashed night in 1832, its grand halls trembled under the weight of thunder, and its chandeliers swayed with each shudder of wind. Inside, Colonel Harrison Puritan sat in his study, pouring brandy, a man who believed himself untouchable. He had no idea that 2 cries of life, just yards apart, would unmake everything his ancestors had built. Upstairs, Countess Margot de Villefort labored in her chamber, her fingers clutching the carved bedposts, sweat staining her silken gown. The storm outside mirrored the war within her. The child she carried was not the colonel's heir, but the fruit of a secret affair with Dr. Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, a French exile who had wormed his way into Charleston's elite through medicine, discretion, and dangerous charm. Every contraction brought not only pain but dread, for when that baby drew breath, its features would tell the truth Margot could never speak aloud. Meanwhile, in a cottage on the estate grounds, Celeste, Margot's personal attendant, bit down on leather to silence her cries. Her child was the colonel's, conceived in nights she had never chosen, nights whispered about in Charleston parlors, but never spoken of in public. The cruel irony, her son would bear the unmistakable Puritan nose, the same angular profile that hung in oil portraits across the mansion's halls. He was the heir in blood, yet by law, by skin, by chains, he would be born enslaved. The storm grew worse. Windows rattled, the harbour waves crashed like cannon fire, and as the hour before dawn approached, both children came into the world. Margot's child, a girl with olive skin and dark curls that betrayed her father. Celeste's child, a boy, pale, with features too perfect a reflection of Colonel Puritan to be denied. It was Mama Ruth, the ancient midwife, who first understood the catastrophe. She had delivered countless babies of both the enslaved and the elite, and she alone could see the truth instantly. If the colonel laid eyes on either child, ruin would fall. Margot's affair would be exposed. Celeste's son would be condemned to the fields or sold away, his bloodline buried under slavery's iron silence. Dr. Rousseau, hands trembling as he held Margot's daughter, whispered the unthinkable. "We cannot show him. If he sees, all is lost." The Countess's amber eyes burned with terror. Celeste, exhausted but defiant, clutched her newborn as though the walls themselves might snatch him away. And then Mama Ruth spoke words that froze them all. "The only way forward is to exchange them. The boy must be hers, the girl must be yours. Only then will they survive." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Margot's mind raced, her aristocratic training warring with the primal terror of exposure. Celeste's heart tore as the weight of Ruth's words sank in. To give her son to another, to raise her daughter as a slave. It was unthinkable, yet the alternative was worse. And so, in the half-light of dawn, a pact was sealed without ceremony, without law, without witness, except for God and the storm itself. Mama Ruth swaddled the infants and switched them. Margot's arms closed around a child who was not hers, yet who would be paraded as the Puritan heir. Celeste, silent tears carving lines into her face, held the girl who was of noble blood but condemned to bondage. What happened in that room was not a momentary deception. It was the planting of a seed, one that would take root and grow into a tangle of lies, cover-ups and blood that would poison the Puritan dynasty for decades. The Countess and the slave were now bound together, their fates chained tighter than iron by a secret that could never be spoken. This was not just the birth of two children, it was the birth of a conspiracy. The storm passed, but the house still smelled of rain and candle smoke when Colonel Harrison Puritan finally climbed the stairs to see his son. His boots echoed against the polished floorboards, each step carrying the weight of expectation. The dynasty required an heir, and now at last, one had been delivered. Margot sat upright in her bed, her silk gown changed, her hair arranged just enough to mask the hours of torment. In her arms she held not her daughter, but Celeste's infant son, swaddled tightly, his skin pale, his features unmistakably Puritan. The colonel's eyes widened. His stern face cracked into something rarely seen: pride. "Charles Harrison Puritan," he declared, naming the child after his grandfather. He kissed the boy's forehead, utterly blind to the betrayal cradled in his own arms. Below stairs, Celeste sat in the cottage with her daughter, the Countess's true child, nursing her in silence. She named the girl Marie. To the world, Marie was nothing more than another slave child, an afterthought in a system designed to erase such lives before they began. But to Celeste, every breath of that baby carried the echo of what had been stolen from her. A heritage, a name, a freedom that could never be claimed. From the first day, the Pact demanded constant vigilance. Dr. Rousseau quietly altered the records, writing in his neat French hand that the Countess had given birth to a healthy male heir, and nothing more. The midwife, Mama Ruth, swore her silence, a silence bought not with gold, but with the weight of every secret she'd kept for Charleston's elite. To betray one mistress was to betray them all, and she knew her survival depended on her tongue remaining sealed. But secrets are heavy things. They press against the walls of a house, seeping into the cracks, waiting to be discovered. Already the staff whispered of oddities, the Countess's strange attachment tease, Oh, Celeste's daughter, her insistence that the girl be raised close to young Charles, educated alongside him. Margot explained it away with aristocratic poise, saying Marie's intelligence made her a fitting companion for her son. But in Charleston's drawing rooms, matrons exchanged knowing glances. Too much attention for a slave child was always dangerous. Years passed, and the illusion thickened like plaster hardening over a fissure. Charles grew strong, handsome, every inch the heir his father believed him to be. At gatherings, neighbors remarked on his resemblance to the colonel, on the Puritan nose he carried proudly. Each word was a dagger buried deeper into Celeste's heart. She could not claim him. She could only watch as her son played in halls that should have been his by right, even as she polished the silver that lay on the family table. Margot, for her part, lived in a state of constant tension. Every moment of triumph carried the shadow of discovery. Every time the boy smiled at her, she remembered the lie she had woven with her own hands, and so she clung to Marie, the daughter she could not acknowledge publicly, but whom she loved with a ferocity that unsettled those around her. The Countess insisted Marie sit at her side during lessons, wear fine dresses and receive a French education. It was a risk, but it was also a compulsion. To neglect the girl was impossible. To love her openly was forbidden. Charleston society began to whisper, a countess who doted on a slave child, a boy who grew too clever, too questioning for his own good, a household where invisible strings pulled tighter every year. Beneath the chandeliers and piano music, beneath the clink of wine glasses at Puritan dinners, the poison spread silently. The Pact had held, but its weight was growing heavier, and as Charles and Marie's bond deepened, two children linked by blood they did not know, how they shared, the first cracks in the deception began to appear. By the mid-1830s, the Puritan household pulsed with a quiet tension no one dared name aloud. On the surface, everything was as it should be, the colonel presiding over his vast rice and cotton estates, the countess dazzling Charleston society with her refinement, and young Charles, the pride of the dynasty, growing into a boy admired for his wit and charm. But beneath that surface, the storm that had begun on the night of his birth had never truly ended. It was simply gathering strength in silence. Charles was no ordinary child. From the age of 5, he devoured books with unnatural speed. He solved puzzles meant for men twice his age. Tutors left the mansion whispering that they had never seen a child so sharp, so relentless in his curiosity. But intelligence can be a dangerous gift, especially when it turns inward. Charles asked questions no one wanted him to ask. Why did his skin not darken like his cousins? Why did his hair not curl the way others in his family's line did? Why, when he studied the portraits of Puritan ancestors that lined the hallway, did their eyes not quite match his? Margot answered with rehearsed precision, her voice calm, her smile perfect. You take after your father's grandfather. Strong features, a fair complexion. Blood remembers what it chooses, Charles. But her hands trembled when she said it. And Charles, brilliant, relentless Charles, noticed. Marie, meanwhile, grew in the shadows of contradiction. To the world, she was a slave child. But inside the mansion, the Countess treated her with a tenderness no one could understand. She learned to read, to write, to play the piano with skill that stunned guests when she was permitted to perform. At table, she sat closer to the Countess than any servant had the right to. In secret, Margot whispered French lullabies to her, lullabies no mistress would ever sing to a slave. The bond between them, children, only deepened the unease. Charles and Marie shared something no tutor could teach, no society rule could explain. They seemed to move in tandem, as though an invisible thread bound their thoughts. They finished each other's sentences, laughed at jokes before they were spoken, and defended each other with a loyalty far beyond ordinary childhood affection. It was more than companionship. It was recognition at a level neither understood, but both felt in their bones. Charleston society noticed. At dinner parties, planters' wives leaned close and whispered, "Why does the Countess insist on raising that girl with her son? It is not natural. It is not proper." Men muttered in clubs that Margot's French eccentricities were beginning to taint the Puritan name. Rumors spread that perhaps the Countess herself had foreign sympathies too radical for Southern tradition. Some suggested she had gone mad. Others suspected she was plotting something more sinister. Inside the mansion, Celeste bore her silent torment. Each time Charles passed her in the halls, her heart swelled with a pride she could not reveal. Each time Marie sat on the Countess's lap, draped in a dress finer than any slave child had worn before, Celeste felt both relief and sorrow. She loved her daughter, yet she knew every privilege Marie received was stolen from Charles's rightful place as her son. Dr. Rousseau returned often, ostensibly as physician, but in truth as guardian of the Pact. He saw Charles's questioning eyes, saw Marie's uncanny grace, saw the Countess unraveling under the strain of guarding two secrets at once. He warned her gently, in French only the two of them shared. The more you cling to both children, the more others will notice. Your love is too visible. It draws suspicion, like blood draws sharks. But Margot could not stop herself. To protect Marie was as essential as breathing. The deception had survived childbirth. It had survived the fragile first years. But children grow, and with growth comes danger. Each new word Charles spoke, each glance Marie cast, was another thread tugged loose in the tapestry of lies. The pact still held, but already the mansion itself seemed to pulse with a truth struggling to be revealed. And in Charleston, whispers spread like smoke. The Puritan house was hiding something. Charleston society thrived on appearances. In the parlors and drawing rooms of East Bay Street, reputations were currency, traded more carefully than gold. And for years the Puritans had spent lavishly. Their mansion gleamed, their dinners overflowed with European wine, their lineage seemed untouchable. But appearances are fragile things. They fracture with a whisper, they shatter with a glance. It began with subtle comments. A visiting planter remarked on how strangely the Countess favored the slave girl Marie, insisting the child share lessons with her son. A cousin of the colonel raised an eyebrow at Charles's brilliance, muttering that no Puritan had ever been known for intellectual fire. Strong backs, yes, political cunning perhaps, but not this precocious spark that seemed almost foreign. At church, matrons nodded politely but whispered after service, "The Countess is too eccentric, too French. Something is off." The colonel, oblivious at first, eventually began to notice the peculiarities himself. He adored his son, no doubt, but even he found the Countess's indulgence of Marie unsettling. At dinner he caught her watching the girl with a softness he rarely saw her show anyone else. "She is a slave, Margot," he reminded her one evening, his tone sharp. "You elevate her too much. The other families are beginning to talk." Margot's response was poised, but the glint in her eyes betrayed her fear. Charles requires companionship. He thrives when challenged. Marie is bright, brighter than most children of her station. Why should we deny him the best environment for learning? Her words rang with logic, but in the South of 1830s Charleston, logic bent beneath the weight of tradition. A slave was a slave, and for a countess to blur that line was an insult to every planter wife who clung to hierarchy like a lifeline. Celeste felt the shift most acutely. Whispers reach, at even the servant quarters. Other slaves began murmuring that the Countess loved Marie too much, that perhaps the girl carried white blood, that perhaps, dangerously, she was not what she seemed. Celeste silenced them with sharp glares, but inside her terror grew. The very survival of both children depended on silence, and silence was breaking. Then came the most dangerous moment yet. At a summer gathering in 1837, Colonel Puritan's brother Edmund, visiting from Savannah, leaned over Charles and studied him with unsettling intensity. "He is a fine boy," Edmund said slowly, "but I do not see you in him, Harrison. His eyes, his carriage, there is something foreign about it." The words struck like a blade. For an instant Margot's breath caught. The colonel's face tightened, pride warring with a flash of doubt. He laughed it off with a toast to family, but that night, in the privacy of his study, he demanded explanations. "Margot," he growled, "tell me the truth. Why does my son remind me of no man in this line?" It was the first true test of the pact. And Margot, her back against the abyss, answered with a lie sharpened to perfection. "Because he is mine, and I am French. Look to my family portraits, Harrison, and you will see him there. Do you doubt me, or your own blood?" Her eyes blazed with aristocratic fire, and the colonel, a man trained to prize appearances over all else, chose silence over scandal. He poured himself another glass and spoke no more of it. But suspicion, once awakened, never sleeps. From that night onward, the colonel watched his wife more closely. He scrutinized his son's mannerisms. He studied Marie with narrowed eyes when he caught the Countess gazing at her too long. Doubt had entered the house, and doubt is a disease. It corrodes, it waits, it destroys from within. The Pact had survived yet again, but only because everyone involved understood the stakes. If truth broke through, it would not only ruin reputations, it would end lives. And still, the children grew closer, their bond defying all boundaries. With every shared glance, with every echo of unspoken understanding, they threatened to expose what no one dared say aloud. By 1839, the Puritan household had settled into a rhythm on the surface. The colonel pursued his affairs of land and politics, the Countess maintained her carefully constructed elegance, and the staff performed their duties with the silence of shadows. But the real current of life inside the mansion was not controlled by the colonel's orders or the Countess's routines. It was driven by two children who were not who they seemed, Charles and Marie. Their connection was undeniable. At 6 and 7, they moved as if one mind guided them both. In the gardens, they invented elaborate games no tutor had taught them. They spoke in fragments others could not follow, finishing each other's sentences, sometimes answering aloud to questions the other had only just begun to think. Servants whispered that the two were bewitched, tied by something unnatural. Tutors shook their heads, baffled by how quickly both absorbed knowledge, how easily they seemed to mirror each other's thoughts. Charles's brilliance only intensified. He could recite passages from Latin texts after a single reading. He sketched maps of the Carolina coastline with precision that startled seasoned sailors. But what unsettled his family most was not his intelligence, it was his intuition. He noticed what others tried to hide. When a servant limped, he asked where they had been beaten. When the colonel returned late from the slave quarters, Charles's eyes narrowed, as if he understood more than a child ever should. His questions became harder to answer. Marie, though outwardly marked as a slave, carried herself with the quiet grace of someone born to another station. She walked with the same poise as the Countess, played piano with a sensitivity that silenced entire rooms, and spoke French with a fluency no slave child should have possessed. Guests who visited the mansion sometimes paused when she entered, whispering among themselves, "There is something strange about that girl." The Countess clung to Marie more fiercely with each passing year, disguising her obsession as education or charity. But in truth, she was torn between two compulsions, the desperate need to protect her true daughter and the equally desperate need to keep the illusion intact. She doted on Charles publicly, ensuring no suspicion could fall. Yet in secret she slipped books to Marie, corrected her accent, stroked her hair with a tenderness that no mistress should give a servant. Her love was as dangerous as it was undeniable. Celeste lived with a torment that no one could name. She polished the silver for her son's table, pressed his clothes, and bowed her head when he passed. He looked like her, he laughed like her, but he did not know her. To him she was only a servant, not a mother. And each time she heard him call the Countess Maman, her heart fractured all over again. Meanwhile, she raised Marie with quiet devotion, knowing the girl's brilliance, her very survival, would only sharpen society's suspicion. It was Dr. Rousseau who first sensed the true danger. During one visit, he found the children sitting together by the fire, silent, simply staring into the flames as though sharing the same thought. When he asked what they were doing, Charles answered without hesitation, "We are remembering." Marie nodded, her small face solemn. "But we don't know what we are remembering yet." The words chilled him. Children should not speak with such weight. He watched them carefully, noting how their gazes seemed to lock onto truths others could not see. The deception had created more than a lie. It had created a mystery in flesh and blood. Two children switched by necessity, bound by blood unacknowledged, seemed to carry a knowledge neither had been taught. And in Charleston, rumors were spreading. A boy too clever, a girl too refined, a countess too indulgent. Neighbors whispered of sorcery, of French eccentricities, of corruption in the Puritan house. The line between curiosity and accusation was thinning. The pact still held, but the children themselves had become the greatest threat to it. By 1840, Charleston had grown tired of whispering. Whispers had hardened into suspicions, and suspicions into quiet hostility. The Puritan family, once a pillar of Southern respectability, now carried the faint odor of scandal, unspoken but impossible to ignore. At the center of the unease stood the children. Charles dazzled tutors and embarrassed older cousins with his intellect, but brilliance in a boy bred unease more than admiration. "Precocious children rarely make steady men," one planter muttered. "Too clever by half, and cleverness breeds arrogance." Others wondered aloud if the boy was truly a Puritan at all. No one dared say bastard, not in the colonel's presence, but the word hung in the air like a noose. Marie's presence was even more dangerous. A slave girl who spoke French, played piano, and dressed better than some planter daughters. It was not simply unusual, it was provocative. The Countess excused it as philanthropy, a noble lady's eccentric indulgence. But in Charleston's rigid world, philanthropy had limits. Marie's refinement blurred lines that were not meant to be blurred, and society punished such transgressions not with words, but with cold, deliberate cruelty. Invitations began to thin. Neighbors who once attended Puritan dinners made excuses. The Countess noticed it first, but soon even the colonel could not ignore it. His political allies grew distant. A proposed partnership in a shipping venture quietly dissolved. Charleston's elite did not confront scandal. They isolated it, like a sickness. The colonel's patience frayed. One night after returning from a tense meeting with fellow planters, he confronted his wife. "Margot, your indulgence of that girl has cost us. Do you not see how they look at us? Do you not see what they say of me?" The Countess, her back straight, her chin lifted, answered with the steel of her French blood. "And what, would you have me do? Cast her aside? Sell her? Abandon a child who has lived in this house as long as your son?" "Yes," the colonel thundered. "If that is what it takes to silence their tongues, then yes." It was the closest Margot had ever come to breaking. She did not shout, she did not weep, but her silence cut deeper than any scream, and the colonel, sensing he had struck something he did not fully understand, retreated to his study. But from that night forward, his eyes on Marie grew harder, sharper, more suspicious. Celeste, listening from the shadows, felt her heart seize with fear. The Pact had been dangerous from the first breath, but now it teetered on the edge of exposure. If the colonel acted, if Marie was sold or cast away, the delicate balance would collapse, and with it, the lives of both children. Meanwhile, the children themselves only deepened the peril. Their closeness had matured into something uncanny. At times they seemed to anticipate each other's thoughts. During lessons, Charles would pause mid-sentence and Marie would finish the line in perfect rhythm. At night, servants whispered that the two often sat awake long past bedtime, speaking in hushed tones that carried the strange gravity of adults. It was not long before rumors of witchcraft began to spread. Charleston was no Salem, but superstition thrived beneath its polished manners. A French countess, a foreign doctor, a pair of children bound by something unseen. It was too much for the city's gossips to resist. And so the Puritan name began to erode, not in court, not in public, but in the more deadly arena of reputation. Doors closed, allies turned cold. The very society that once envied the Puritans now sharpened knives in silence. The Pact had bought survival, but at a cost. It had planted seeds of doubt in every corner of Charleston, and seeds, once sown, always grow. By 1841, the colonel's pride was wounded. Once he had been welcomed as a leader of Charleston's planter elite, his name invoked with respect in matters of politics and trade. Now he found himself excluded from ventures, omitted from invitations, and whispered about in drawing rooms where he had once reigned. Pride is a dangerous wound, it festers, and in the colonel, it demanded retribution. He could not strike at Charleston society directly, that would admit weakness, but he could strike within his own house, and he knew exactly where to begin. Marie. The girl had become a symbol of everything unsettling in his household, the Countess's eccentricities, the strange bond with his son, the whispers of impropriety. To remove her would be to cauterize the wound. To keep her was to bleed out slowly. One evening, after a long silence over supper, he spoke the words that sealed his intent. "The girl will be sent away." The Countess froze, her fork poised in mid-air. "Sent? Where?" "To the rice fields, to another estate, anywhere but here. She is a slave, Margot, and I will not have her paraded in parlors like a daughter." His voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. For a moment the Pact trembled on the edge of ruin. If Marie left the mansion, if she was thrown into the fields, the truth would unravel in weeks. Her refinement, her education, her resemblance to the Countess. Someone would notice, someone would question, and once questions began, there would be no stopping them. Margot answered with a composure that cost her everything. "If you send her away, Harrison, you will break your son. Charles cannot be without her. He thrives with her. Separate them, and you risk destroying the very heir you prize so dearly." The Colonel's jaw tightened. He did not argue further, but his silence was worse than fury. From that night onward, Marie's presence in the mansion became precarious. One wrong gesture, one wrong word, and she would be gone. Celeste lived in terror. Each morning she expected to hear the order. Each night she prayed the day had passed without it. She began planning escape routes in her mind, which roads to take, which swamps to hide in, who among the free black families in Charleston might offer shelter. But escape was almost impossible. The Pitons were powerful, and the net of slavery stretched across every mile of the South. Dr. Rousseau, sensing the danger, urged Margot to act with caution. "You must not defy him openly," he warned. "A husband humiliated is more dangerous than any enemy outside. But you must protect her. Without Marie, the deception cannot hold." And so Margot devised subtler defenses. She insisted Marie's lessons continue, arguing that Charles required constant intellectual challenge. She positioned the girl as indispensable to her son's progress, framing her presence as utility rather than indulgence. The Colonel, grudgingly, allowed it, for the moment. But the children themselves only sharpened the peril. Charles sensed his father's hostility, though he could not name its cause. "Why does he look at Marie as if she is less than I?" he demanded of his mother. Margot faltered, unable to craft an answer that would both comfort her son and protect the lie. Marie, more perceptive, said nothing, but in her silence there was fear. The truth was closing in. The Colonel's doubts had hardened into intent. Society's whispers had become knives at the Piton throat, and yet the Pact still held, barely, desperately, like a bridge swaying over a storm. But bridges can only hold so long before they break. By the mid-1840s, Charles had grown into a young man of striking presence. Tall, sharp-featured, with the easy confidence of wealth and privilege, he commanded attention wherever he walked, but beneath the polished exterior, a storm was forming. The boy who once trusted every word from his mother's lips had become a teenager who questioned everything. He noticed the contradictions, the silences, the subtle glances exchanged among the adults. He saw how his father's approval was conditional, brittle, built not on love but on expectation. He saw how his mother's protectiveness bordered on suffocation. And most of all, he saw how Marie lived in a world that made no sense. She was a slave, yet she was educated. She was dressed simply, yet carried herself like nobility. She was treated as essential to the family, yet never acknowledged as kin. The dissonance gnawed at Charles's mind like acid on metal. One evening, during a lavish dinner party, the tension erupted. A guest, emboldened by wine, sneered at Marie as she refilled his glass. "A clever girl for a house servant," he remarked, "almost forgettable, if not for her airs." Charles's fist slammed against the table, rattling the silverware. "She is not forgettable," he growled. "She is worth 10 of you." The room froze. The Colonel's face flushed crimson with rage, but Margot intervened quickly, her laughter cutting the tension like a blade. "Ah, youth," she said smoothly, "so quick to defend those they care for. Charles forgets himself, but his passion is admirable, is it not?" The moment passed, but the damage was done. Charleston society now had fresh whispers to carry into parlors and onto porches. The Puritan heir defending a slave girl. It was scandal disguised as rumor, and it would not be forgotten. After the guests departed, the Colonel confronted his son. His hand cracked across Charles's face with the force of a pistol shot. "You shame me," he spat. "You speak as if she were your equal. She is nothing. Do you understand? Nothing." But Charles, blood on his lip, did not bow. "If she is nothing, father, then what does that make you, who depends on her every day? What does that make all of us, living on the backs of those we pretend not to see?" The colonel raised his hand again, but stopped. For the first time, he saw not a boy to be corrected, but a young man who might one day stand against him. From that night on, Charles's rebellion sharpened. He read abolitionist tracts smuggled from the north, debated with Dr. Rousseau about justice and hypocrisy, and questioned the very foundations of the society that had shaped him. His mother tried desperately to guide his fury, but it was like trying to contain a river with bare hands. Marie, too, felt the weight of his awakening. Their bond deepened into something dangerous, an unspoken loyalty that defied the rules of race, class, and blood. They trusted each other in ways they trusted no one else, and though neither could name the truth of their connection, it pulsed between them like an unseen current. The Pact had created an heir, but now, that heir was beginning to tear apart the very system it was designed to protect. And in his rebellion, Charles was unknowingly reaching for the truth, a truth that once uncovered would burn everything his parents had built to ash. By 1847, the tension within the Puritan mansion no longer stayed confined to its walls. It leaked into Charleston society, carried in glances, in half-finished sentences, in the subtle cruelty of gossip. But what no one could deny was this: the Puritan heir, Charles, was brilliant, and always at his side was the slave girl, Marie. The Countess had insisted Marie be educated, cloaked under the excuse that she was a companion for Charles. But education is a dangerous gift. It cannot be confined. Marie's mind blossomed. She absorbed languages, history, music, philosophy. She began to speak with a quiet authority that unsettled guests who mistook her for a servant, only to be silenced by her eloquence. And Charles admired her above all. In his eyes, she was not a servant, but his equal, perhaps even his better. She challenged his ideas, tested his arguments, forced him to sharpen his intellect. Together, they formed a partnership that was far more than friendship. It was dangerous because it was undeniable. At first, their closeness was written off as youthful indulgence, but as the years passed, whispers grew sharper. "The boy is too close to her," people murmured. "It is not proper. He forgets who he is." One evening, the danger arrived in flesh and blood. Judge Nathaniel Rhodes, a man with influence in Charleston and an eye for profit, dined with the Puritans. He was a man who prided himself on sniffing out vulnerabilities, and he noticed Marie. When she corrected his Latin quotation during conversation, Rhodes's eyes narrowed. "Remarkable," he said slowly, his voice dripping with false admiration, "for a girl of her station." The colonel shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The Countess smiled with her usual grace. Only Celeste felt the cold dread that spread through the room. Rhodes was no fool. He was filing away details, weighing them, measuring where advantage meets. Might be gained. Later in private, Rhodes spoke plainly to the colonel. "It is one thing to indulge a companion for your son. It is another to parade her as if she were something more. Charleston society has long memories, Harrison. Be careful you do not give them a reason to sharpen their knives." The warning was clear. Rumors were becoming leverage, and in the antebellum South, leverage meant power. Charles, of course, cared nothing for warnings. His rebellion only grew. He began speaking openly, too openly, about the injustice of slavery. "If intelligence is the measure of worth," he told his father one night at supper, "then tell me, who in this house deserves freedom more, Marie or half the men who drink your wine and call themselves gentlemen?" The colonel's fist slammed the table. "Enough!" But Charles did not back down. His eyes burned with the conviction of a man no longer willing to be silent, and Marie, though she said nothing, felt the walls of the mansion closing in around her. For in the South, knowledge in the hands of the enslaved was not a gift, it was a crime, and Marie carried that crime in her every word, her every gesture. Her brilliance was the very evidence that could unravel the Pact, destroy Charles's future, and expose the Countess's sin. The secret had survived storms, births, and betrayals, but now it faced its most dangerous enemy, attention. And once attention settles on forbidden truth, there is no returning to the shadows. By the dawn of the 1850s, Charleston was no longer the untouched jewel it had once been. The air carried tension, whispers of abolitionist plots and rumors of uprisings. The planter elite felt the ground shifting beneath them, but they clung to the illusion of control with desperate fingers. And in that brittle atmosphere, the Puritan family stood out. The whispers about their household had not vanished. They had hardened, taken root, and begun to grow into questions. Charles's defiance had not gone unnoticed, Marie's education had not gone unseen, and men with sharp eyes and sharper ambitions smelled opportunity. Judge Rhodes was the first to test the cracks. Under the guise of friendship, he invited Colonel Puritan to private dinners where wine flowed freely and conversations slipped toward dangerous edges. "Tell me, Harrison," Rhodes would murmur, swirling his glass, "is it true your son consults a slave girl on his studies? Some say she corrects him. That is unusual, is it not?" The colonel laughed it off, of course. "Children grow fond of companions," he said with forced ease. "She is nothing more than a playmate who outlived her use." But Rhodes was not convinced, nor was he the only one. Ministers began to preach against unnatural household arrangements without naming names, though everyone knew the target. Plantation neighbors whispered behind fans and cigars, waiting for the day the scandal would surface. Inside the mansion, pressure built like steam in a sealed chamber. Celeste walked on knives, watching for signs that someone had guessed the truth. Dr. Rousseau urged caution at every turn, reminding Margot that even a slip of the tongue could end them all. But Charles was deaf to caution. His convictions had sharpened into steel. "Why should I lie to protect their hypocrisy?" he demanded one night. "Why should I bow to men who profit from chains?" His moes. Their eyes filled with fear. "Because if you speak too loudly, my son, they will not only silence you, they will drag Marie with you, and they will not stop until the Puritan name is ash." The threat was not exaggerated. In Charleston, even suspicion could be fatal. A whisper of scandal could strip a man of his fortune, his allies, his very place in society, and for an enslaved girl who seemed too intelligent, too refined, the punishment would be worse. But perhaps the most dangerous pressure came from within Charles himself, for though he had not uncovered the truth of his blood, some instinct drove him toward it. He felt a kinship with Marie that defied explanation, a bond deeper than friendship or loyalty. It was as if some hidden law of nature tied them together. Marie, for her part, understood the peril of that bond. She began withdrawing, softening her presence, hiding her brilliance where she could. But it was too late. Too many eyes had seen, too many ears had heard. The Pact, once a private deception guarded by 4 people, was now a house with open windows in a storm. Every gust of rumor, every probing question, every lingering glance threatened to blow the entire structure to the ground. And when outsiders begin to circle, secrets are no longer secrets, they are prey. The colonel had endured enough. For years he had borne the whispers, the sidelong glances, the unspoken questions. Pride had sustained him through battles of politics and commerce, but pride can only stretch so far before it hardens into wrath, and by 1852 his wrath demanded sacrifice. One evening, as the oil lamps flickered against the panelled walls of his study, the colonel summoned his wife. Margot entered with measured grace, her amber eyes unreadable, but her pulse quickened as she saw the expression on his face. "It ends tonight," he said. "What ends?" she asked, though she already knew. "The girl, Marie, she will be sold." The words fell like a guillotine. For years the Countess had maneuvered, distracted, and soothed her husband away from this very decision. But now there was no hesitation in his voice. He had made his choice, to rid himself of the shame, to silence the gossip, to restore his household's purity in the eyes of society. Marie had to be removed. Margot's breath caught. "You cannot," she whispered, every syllable trembling with contained fury. She is Charles's shadow. His mind is entwined with hers. Tear them apart, and you will destroy the very heir you claim to protect." But the colonel's face was stone. "Better to break him now than let him grow into a man who shames me further. Better a bitter son than a ruined dynasty." For the first time in their marriage, Margot saw her husband not as the master of their world, but as its executioner. If Marie were sold, the truth would unravel in days. The girl was not just her daughter, she was the living proof of their crime, and yet Margot could not say that aloud. To reveal it now would be suicide. When she left the study that night, her hands shook so violently she could barely close the door. In her chamber, Celeste waited, her face pale. "I heard," she whispered. "He means it." Margot G.E. ripped her arm. "Then we must act before he does." It was not simply a matter of maternal instinct, it was survival. Without Marie, their secret could not be contained. The pact would collapse, and all four of them, Margot, Celeste, Rousseau, and even Charles, would be crushed beneath it. The Countess did something that night she had never done before. She defied her husband openly. The next morning she announced to the household that Marie was indispensable to her health. "She tends to me in ways no one else can," she told the colonel at breakfast, her voice calm, her expression unyielding. "Remove her, and you remove me." It was a threat, cloaked in wifely devotion. The colonel's eyes narrowed. For a moment Margot thought he might strike her, or worse. But instead he said nothing. He rose from the table, his boots heavy against the wooden floor, and left without a word. That silence was worse than anger. Silence meant calculation. Silence meant plotting. Silence meant that his decision was not undone, merely delayed. That night Margot called Dr. Rousseau to the mansion. "He will not stop," she told him, her voice low, her hands clasped so tightly they left crescents in her skin. "And when he acts, it will be too late. We must prepare." Rousseau looked at her with the weary eyes of a man who knew how far they had already fallen. "Prepare for what?" Margot's voice dropped to a whisper. "For war within this house." The pact was no longer a secret. It was a battlefield. Charles was no longer a boy. At 19, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had been raised to inherit a dynasty. But beneath that surface, he was restless, almost haunted. The bruises from his father's hand had faded, but the questions they birthed had not. He had grown sharper, hungrier for truth. Nights once spent at plantation banquets were now devoted to books smuggled from northern presses, conversations whispered with sympathetic tutors, and long walks with Marie in the shadowed gardens of the estate. There, away from the eyes of the household, their words roamed where propriety could not. "I feel it, Marie," he said one night as cicadas screamed in the humid air. "Something is wrong in this house, wrong in me." Her dark eyes flickered, but she kept her face composed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he pressed, "that there are secrets no one will tell me. That my father despises you without reason. That my mother clings to you as if you are more than a servant, and that you are more to me than I can explain." Marie's silence was not ignorance, it was survival. But Charles mistook it for confirmation. "You know it too," he said fiercely. "You've always known. There is blood here between us. I can feel it." Marie's heart pounded. She had lived her entire life balancing on the knife's edge of this truth, but now the boy who was her brother, and yet not her brother, was reaching for the blade himself. She wanted to tell him, to break the silence, but one word would not only end her life, it would tear down his future before it began. So she lied. "You imagine ghosts where there are none, Charles. Some things cannot be explained." But he was not convinced. His rebellion against society had sharpened into something deeper, rebellion against silence itself. He began pressing his mother, watching her carefully when he asked about his childhood. "Why do I remember Marie at every lesson, every birthday, every moment? Why does she stand beside me in family portraits when others' servants are nowhere to be seen?" Margot would smile, smooth his hair and say, "Because you needed her, because she is loyal." But her voice trembled, and Charles saw it. Even Dr. Rousseau, once a calm presence, began to feel the weight of Charles's suspicion. During one of their late-night discussions, Charles caught the doctor studying him too closely. "You look at me," Charles said suddenly, "as if you know something about me that I do not." Rousseau froze, then forced a laugh. Every physician knows more about his patients than they know about themselves. But Charles's gaze lingered, piercing, and the doctor knew the boy's instincts were circling too close to the forbidden core. Meanwhile, the colonel grew harsher. Every display of Charles's independence was met with scorn, every defense of Marie with the threat of violence. The father, who should have been proud, now seemed consumed by loathing, a loathing Charles could not explain. It left him torn between two poles, a mother who smothered him with anxious love, and a father who seemed to despise him without cause. In the shadows between them stood Marie, the only person who felt like truth. And that was the danger. Because once a young man commits himself to truth, he cannot be stopped. And once truth stirs beneath a roof built on lies, nothing can hold the house together. The storm Charles felt inside was the same storm that had begun 30 years earlier on the night of the Pact, only now the winds were gathering again, and this time they would not pass. The colonel had brooded long enough. In his mind, Charles's rebellion, Margot's defiance, and Marie's presence were all threads of the same disease, one that threatened to strangle his legacy. And so, in the spring of 1853, he resolved to cut the thread. He acted with the cold efficiency of a soldier. No more warnings. No more threats. One morning, he summoned the overseer, a hard-eyed man named Calder, and gave the order in a low voice. "Prepare the girl. She will be taken to market in Savannah by week's end." Calder nodded without question. To him, Marie was property, nothing more. But when Celeste overheard the instruction, the blood drained from her face. She rushed to Margot's chamber, breathless. "It has begun. He means to sell her. He has given the order." For a moment, Margot could not breathe. The walls of the room seemed to tilt. Her daughter, her secret, her sin, was about to be torn away, dragged into a world of chains and degradation from which there would be no return. "No," Margot whispered, and then louder, firmer. "No, he will not." That night, she summoned Celeste and Dr. Rousseau. The three of them stood in the candle-lit drawing room, shadows looming across their faces like conspirators in a trial. "If she leaves this house," Margot said, her voice shaking with fury, "we are finished. Charles will know, the city will know, and Marie herself will not survive long enough for silence to protect us. We must act." Celeste gripped her hand. "Then we defy him." Rousseau hesitated. His whole life had been built on calculation, not rashness. To stand against the colonel openly is suicide. He has the law, the militia, and society at his back. If you resist, you must be prepared to lose everything. Margot's amber eyes burned. Better to lose everything than to lose her. The pact was no longer secret. It was war. When the colonel next broached the subject of Marie's removal, Margot did what she had never dared before. She challenged him before witnesses. At the breakfast table with Charles seated nearby, she spoke in a voice like steel. "If Marie leaves this house," she said, "so do I. And you may explain to society why your wife has abandoned you." The colonel's knife froze above his plate. His face turned the color of iron. Charles looked between them, bewildered, sensing truths that hovered just beyond reach. "You would shame me before my son," the colonel hissed. "I would save my son," Margot answered. The room crackled with the force of their collision. For a heartbeat, it seemed the colonel might strike her, but then he caught Charles's eyes fixed on him, blazing with contempt. To strike Margot now would only prove the weakness he sought to deny. So instead, he smiled, a thin, venomous smile. "Very well, the girl stays, for now." But everyone at the table knew what that smile meant. The colonel had not surrendered. He had only shifted the battlefield. And Margot, though she had won the moment, felt her hands tremble beneath the tablecloth. For the first time, the war was no longer hidden in whispers. It was open, naked, a struggle for the soul of the family itself. The pact had held for 30 years, But now, with husband and wife standing as enemies across the same table, its days were numbered. The colonel was not a man to forgive defiance. Margot's public challenge at the table had cut him deeply, and worse, Charles had witnessed it. To let such rebellion stand unpunished would invite ruin, yet he was no fool. Direct confrontation had failed. He would need another weapon, one subtler, one that could not be traced back to him. So he turned to the shadows of Charleston society. Among his allies was Judge Nathaniel Rhodes, a man who thrived on secrets the way bankers thrived on coin. To Rhodes, information was currency, and the Puritan household had begun to smell of scandal. One evening, over brandy and cigars, the colonel let slip just enough to whet the judge's appetite. "There is a girl in my house," he said, his voice deliberately careless, "who thinks herself more than she is. My son clings to her as though she were kin. My wife insists she is indispensable. Tell me, Rhodes, what do you make of such a situation?" Rhodes's eyes glimmered with the hunger of a predator. "I make of it," he said slowly, "that your household harbors a liability some might purchase." The colonel said nothing, but he let the silence serve as assent. Within weeks, strange faces began to appear at the estate. Merchants, preachers, plantation men, ostensibly there for business, but their eyes lingered on Marie. They tested her with casual questions, observing her speech, her bearing. They noted how Charles deferred to her, how Margot shielded her, how the servants avoided speaking ill of her. Each observation fed the growing rumor that the Puritan household held something unnatural, something dangerous. Marie felt the weight of their stares like chains. "They look at me as if I were already sold," she whispered to Celeste. Celeste gripped her hand. "That is exactly what he intends." Margot fought to contain the threat, tightening the household, dismissing suspicions, whose visitors when she could. But she knew the colonel's strategy. He was turning society itself into his accomplice. Once the city demanded Marie's removal, she would be powerless to stop it. Charles, meanwhile, bristled against the growing scrutiny. One evening, when a visiting preacher made a sly remark about unnatural affections, Charles snapped. "Unnatural?" he barked. "To value intelligence over ignorance? To admire loyalty over hypocrisy? If that is unnatural, then I embrace it gladly." The outburst spread quickly beyond the walls. By the next day, half of Charleston society was whispering that the Puritan heir was bewitched by a slave girl. It was exactly the leverage Rhodes had hoped for, and exactly the storm the colonel had unleashed. The Pact secrecy was no longer eroding quietly. It was being dragged into the open, weaponized against them. And Marie, caught in the center, understood the truth with piercing clarity. The colonel no longer sought simply to sell her. He sought to erase her, to turn her very existence into a scandal that would consume her, and perhaps Charles with her. For the first time, she wondered if survival meant leaving the Puritan house forever. Charles had grown accustomed to whispers, but now they clung to him like a second skin. At taverns, in lecture halls, even in church pews, men smirked behind their hands, murmuring of the Puritan boy and his slave girl shadow. What had once been innuendo was fast hardening into scandal, and Charles, fiery as his father but guided by conviction rather than pride, refused to bow. When he overheard Calder, the overseer, boasting in town that Marie would soon fetch a fine price in Savannah, Charles's restraint snapped. He strode into the overseer's quarters that very night, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. "You will never speak of her again," Charles growled, standing over the man. Calder sneered, unafraid. "She's property, boy, and when the colonel says she's to be sold, there ain't a thing you can do." Charles struck him. The blow landed with such fury that Calder stumbled back, blood on his lip, shock in his eyes. "If you or anyone else touches her," Charles spat, "you'll answer to me, not my father." The next morning, Calder carried his grievance straight to the colonel. Rage thundered through the mansion. For the first time, Charles and his father stood face to face, not as father and son, but as combatants. "You dare raise your hand against my men?" the colonel roared. "I dare when your men threaten what is mine to protect," Charles shot back. The word mine hung in the air, sharp as a blade. The colonel's face darkened to the color of storm clouds. She is not yours. She is not your equal. She is filth, and I will be rid of her if it takes burning this house to the ground." Charles's voice was steady, though his hands trembled with fury. "If you try, you will have to go through me, and I promise you, Father, I will not yield." Margot's breath caught as she entered midway through the confrontation. She saw in her husband's eyes not mere anger, but calculation, cold and murderous. He was no longer thinking as a father or a master. He was thinking as a man who had discovered a threat to his legacy and was ready to extinguish it at any cost. Later, Margot found Charles pacing in the gardens, his face pale with rage. "Why does he hate her so?" he demanded. "Why does he hate me for loving justice?" Margot laid a trembling hand on his arm. She wanted to tell him everything, that the hatred was not just of Marie, but of what she represented: betrayal, shame, bloodlines corrupted. But the words lodged in her throat like thorns. To reveal the truth would free him, yes, but it would also destroy him. Instead, she said softly, "Because you are becoming more than he can control, and that terrifies him." Charles turned to her, his eyes blazing. "Then let him be terrified. I will never let Marie be dragged away. I will die first." It was a vow spoken in passion, but Margot knew with chilling certainty that he meant it. The Colonel had unleashed outsiders to tighten the noose. Now Charles himself had declared open rebellion. The fragile pact, once hidden in shadows, was being torn apart in the clear light of day. And Marie, caught between them, began to understand that her fate would no longer be decided in whispers, it would be decided in blood. The Colonel's fury did not fade. If anything, it calcified into a plan. He summoned Rhodes back to Charleston, cloaking the meeting as a routine business discussion, but behind closed doors their conversation reeked of conspiracy. "Remove her quietly," the Colonel ordered, his voice low but lethal. "Send her south. Savannah, New Orleans, I care not, she must vanish." Rhodes raised a brow. "And the boy? He clings to her like breath itself." "Let him cling," the Colonel snapped. "A son must learn that obedience is thicker than affection. He will either bend or break." But Marie overheard enough through a cracked door to know the truth. Her life was now a commodity, a bargaining chip in the war between father and son. She sat awake that night in the servants' quarters, staring at the single candle flame until it guttered, weighing two choices: run and live, stay and risk destruction. Margot found her in the early hours, eyes swollen from unshed tears. "He will sell me," Marie whispered, "and Charles, he will be ruined trying to stop him." Margot's hands trembled as she gripped Marie's shoulders. For decades she had carried the secret like a stone in her chest, but never had its weight felt so crushing. If you run, he will follow. If you stay, he will fight. Either path leads to blood. Marie looked at her mistress, her mother, and in that moment, the bond neither could name pulsed in silence. "Then perhaps," Marie said, her voice quiet but resolute, "the truth must finally burn its way free." Margot closed her eyes, shuddering. She had kept the pact to preserve life, but now revelation itself seemed the only shield left. And once spoken, truth could not be caged again. The storm broke not with rain, but with confrontation. Charles burst into the great hall, his boots muddy from the fields, his voice echoing against the marble walls. "Father," he said, his chest heaving, "I know what you plan. You would sell her like livestock, over my dead body." The Colonel, seated by the hearth with a glass of brandy, did not rise. His gaze was cold steel. "You mistake yourself for a man who makes choices. You are my son, my blood, and you will learn your place, or I will cut it from you." Charles's jaw tightened. "Then hear me now. Marie is my choice, my family. Touch her, and I swear the Puritan name will die with me." The silence that followed was suffocating. Flames cracked in the hearth, the only witness to a line drawn in fire. From the stairwell above, Marie listened, her hand pressed to her mouth. She could not bear to watch Charles be destroyed for defending her, and yet she knew that fleeing would break him more completely than any lash or bullet. It was Margot who descended slowly, her gown whispering along the steps. "Enough," she said, her voice trembling but sharp. She looked from husband to son, then to Marie. "This war between you both is not of her making, it is of mine." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "What nonsense is this?" Margot's amber gaze did not falter. "The night she was born, neither of you know the truth. And if I must speak it to stop this madness, then so be it." Her words sliced the air, a blade of revelation unsheathed. For the first time in decades, the secret clawed its way toward daylight, and all three, father, son, and daughter, felt the ground begin to quake beneath them. Margot stood in the hall as if before a tribunal, her voice low but unshaken. "Charles, Marie, the two of you are bound by blood far deeper than love or friendship. The night of that storm in 1832, 2 children were born under this roof, but they were not raised as they were born." The colonel rose violently, his chair scraping against the stone. "Margot, silence!" His command cracked like a whip, but she did not yield. "You will not silence me again, Harrison. For 30 years I have carried your lies and my own. But tonight they burn." She turned to Charles, her eyes brimming. "You were not my son. You were hers." She gestured to Marie. "Celeste bore you. And Marie, she is mine. My daughter. My blood." The words fell like thunder, impossible to recall, impossible to deny. Charles staggered back as though struck. His hand gripped the banister, his breath ragged. "What are you saying? That everything, my name, my place, was stolen?" Marie's knees nearly buckled. She pressed her palm against the wall to steady herself. "All these years, enslaved, when I should have been free." The colonel's face twisted, veins rising in his temple. "Margot, you wretch, you would destroy us all with this madness." But Margot's eyes flashed with a fury long buried. "It was your lust that forced this deception, your cruelty that left no other path. You enslaved your own daughter and raised another's son as heir. That is the legacy you built." Silence drowned the hall, but it was no peace, only the silence before collapse. Charles's fists shook, his gaze darting between Marie and his father. His whole life had just been unmade, his identity ripped away in a single breath. And Marie's eyes burned with both grief and liberation. She had been denied everything, but now finally she knew who she was. The hall erupted. The colonel lunged forward, his voice a roar of rage. "Lies! All of it! Lies to poison my house!" His hand went to the mantel, seizing the pistol he kept hidden there. Charles stepped between him and Marie, his voice shaking but unyielding. "If you fire that gun, it will be at your own blood. Do you understand? She is your daughter." For a flicker of a second, the colonel hesitated. Then his face hardened, and the barrel rose. "Better she die than my name rot in shame." The shot cracked through the mansion like a thunderclap, but it was not Marie who fell. It was the colonel himself. Charles had struck his arm just as he fired, and the bullet tore into his own chest. He collapsed onto the marble, clutching at blood that spread across his waistcoat. Margot screamed, rushing to his side, but the colonel's final gaze was not at her. It was at Charles, burning, bitter, unrepentant, before his eyes glazed in death. Silence followed. Only the fire hissed in the hearth. Charles dropped the weapon, his breath ragged. "It's done," he whispered. "The curse of this house is ended." But Margot knew the truth. Nothing was ended. The scandal could not be hidden. Courthouse records would be torn open, neighbors would whisper, enemies would feast. Charles had inherited not a dynasty, but ashes. Marie, though freed by blood, bore scars deeper than any chain. As dawn broke over Charleston, the Puritan mansion stood quiet, its great windows staring blankly toward the harbor. A dynasty built on deception had fallen in a single night, its secrets unmasked, its future consumed. And those who survived would forever carry the weight of a pact signed in blood, in silence, and in sin. The deadly Pact of 1832 had finally claimed its price.